The best way to figure out what support works for breastfeeding mothers is to look at the support we are currently providing and examine its effectiveness. This is exactly what Anna Gavine has done. She is a lecturer in health sciences at the University of Dundee, UK, and she has completed a Cochrane review based on trial data from 98,000 mother-infant pairs. When you examine such vast amount of data, there will be patterns and findings that will show up that otherwise wouldn't show themselves. And this information is a very important input on how we organize support for breastfeeding mothers. For example, did you know that during the 4 to 6 weeks period and the 3 to 4 months period, moms are much more likely to drop breastfeeding than at any other period during their breastfeeding journey? Being aware of such findings not only helps mothers to carry on breastfeeding longer, but also helps healthcare professionals to organize their support for breastfeeding mothers more efficiently. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and keep your ears open for our upcoming fundraiser for the breast pump that mimics suckling. And now, enjoy the talk. I'm here today with Anna Gavine, and thank you for joining me.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So today we're talking about the Cochrane review on the effectiveness of breastfeeding support, and it examines whether breastfeeding support would have mothers continue to breastfeed when compared to standard maternity care. The support here refers to help from both health professionals as well as volunteer groups. And the review is based on 116 separate trials from 42 countries, ranging from low to high income countries. And so in total, it is based on data from 98,000 mother-infant pairs. The reason I was listing all this out is to emphasize how grounded this overview is on the effectiveness of breastfeeding support. So in the review, you define two categories, breastfeeding only and breastfeeding plus. So could you please explain first, what do you mean by these two categories and why did you find it important to separate them?
Yeah, so the reason for doing this came about because we this review is actually an update of a previous review. It's been done several times now. And in the previous review, when we looked at the analysis, we found that the results of the individual studies varied a lot. And that's something that's called heterogeneity. And by that, I mean that some studies had really beneficial results, whereas others didn't show much difference between the intervention and control groups. And there's different reasons why this might be the case, such as differences between the interventions, what the interventions are made of, the differences between the participants, the context, and also the standard maternity care that the control group is receiving. So when we designed the update, we want to try and take account of this to help us better understand what works and what doesn't in breastfeeding support. So when we looked at existing literature, we identified that it was possible that these multi-component interventions, and that was kind of what we were considering as breastfeeding plus, might be more effective. So we wanted to investigate that further. So for breastfeeding only, what we defined that as is the intervention only contained content around breastfeeding. It might have been delivered in different ways. So it might have been, that they got face-to-face support, or they got, telephone support. It might have been that women were given breast pumps. But if it was only to do with breastfeeding, then it'd be breastfeeding only. But there was also this group of other interventions that we call breastfeeding plus, and that was these sort of multi-component ones that were part of these bigger studies where women were getting extra care. And there were sort of different groups of that, things around wider postnatal care generally, safe baby care, vaccinations, things like that. Or it might have been that there was more antenatal care involved, but the content wasn't just on breastfeeding.
Mm-hmm.
So that was what a breastfeeding plus intervention
I
was.
see. Okay. So let's see the findings first with the breastfeeding only category. There are subcategories there as well. First, the exclusive breastfeeding. So one of the finding is that it is probable that fewer women stop exclusive breastfeeding if they receive breastfeeding support, here meaning the breastfeeding only support. This is something that I think we would all intuitively expect to be the case, but could you please detail this finding?
Yeah, of course. So for the breastfeeding only interventions, we found that support helped the number of women stopping exclusive breastfeeding at 4 to 6 weeks by about 17%. At 2 to 3 months and 4 months, it was about 19%. And at 6 months, this dropped to about 10%. It's also possible that these figures might be a bit of an underestimation as there was missing data in the studies. So by that, what I mean is the studies weren't able to follow up all the women. In these cases, we assumed a worst case scenario where the women we just assumed if the women hadn't given any more data, they stopped breastfeeding. So this might underestimate the findings, but we thought it was better to do that than overestimate them. So this finding of support being more effective for women to help with exclusive breastfeeding has been found in other studies. But I'd say we need more qualitative studies to try and actually unpick why that might be the case to know more about women's experiences. One theory that comes out of the literature from a piece of work by Heather Trickey is that mothers who are highly motivated to breastfeed exclusively might benefit more from the support, but it's definitely something that I think needs looked at further. It's a fairly consistent finding.
I see, I see. And the finding is pretty similar, maybe a tiny bit lower for the category of any breastfeeding.
That's right. So for the breastfeeding only interventions, we found that support helped reduce the number of women doing any breastfeeding at 4 to 6 weeks by about 12%, similar at 3 to 4 months at 13%, and at 6 months again, we could see it drop off to 7%. So just like the exclusive breastfeeding, the benefits tended to be greater earlier on. And I should probably also say that not all the studies measured any and exclusives. So it's probably fair to say that they're not directly comparable, which just adds to the challenges in understanding this very large body of literature.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I understand that this is a separation that you made because you kind of saw it's necessary to distinguish.
Yes.
Um, so then this is the other category, the breastfeeding plus, which was yielding even higher uh, figures, meaning that compared to breastfeeding only support, it would reach as high as 27% during the 4 to 6 weeks marks. Could you explain why do you think the difference is?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So, overall, we found the results for breastfeeding plus much more variable. So, I guess the effects were kind of magnified around, particularly around exclusive breastfeeding. So, for instance, as you say, 20% of women were less likely to stop exclusive breastfeeding at 4 to 6 weeks. And at 6 months, this high number was kind of maintained at 21%. So this is obviously a lot higher numbers than for the breastfeeding only interventions. But interestingly, at 2 months and at 3 to 4 months, there wasn't a statistically significance between the groups, meaning that based on the data, the results seem to be similar between those who received the interventions and those who didn't. And for any breastfeeding, we also found no significant effect at 4 to 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 to 4 months, and 12 months. Although there was a small improvement at 6 months. So similar to breastfeeding only, the effects were greater for exclusive breastfeeding. And there's probably three main reasons why the data seems more variable and might be less reliable too. So the first is that there was far less studies and therefore participants for these breastfeeding plus studies. So for the breastfeeding only interventions, for each outcome that we looked at, we had data from about 12 to 16,000 women. And there was about 40 studies in the mix. For the analysis for breastfeeding plus, we had data from about 2 to 7,000 women for most of the outcomes. And you were talking maybe about 10, 12 studies. And with statistical analysis, generally, the more participants you have, the more precise the findings and the more confident you can be in the results. And they're more likely to pick up kind of small differences between groups if you've got more participants. So that was one reason why the results might be a bit more variable. Secondly, when we look at the studies, we do assessment of the study quality because we can only really be confident in recommending an intervention if we know that the evidence that it's based on is robust. And we did find more issues with quality in the breastfeeding plus interventions. So we're a bit more careful about recommending them in case this has an impact on it. And of course, you could probably have predicted this. There was a lot of variation in the components of the breastfeeding plus interventions and also the context of them too. So, for instance, this group included community-based perinatal care packages in low and middle income countries where, the standard care was absolutely nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these interventions were focused on obesity prevention. Some were done in very areas of high socioeconomic deprivation in high income countries. Other things included things like financial incentives or maternal nutritional supplementation. So the other components really varied a lot. So it almost becomes a little bit like comparing apples and oranges with these interventions. It's hard to know of these which is the most impactful because the numbers in each of these groups is very small. You only had a kind of handful of studies that used the financial incentives, a handful of studies that were kind of antenatal care focused. So it's difficult to conclude if any of these in particular was more effective. We couldn't specifically analyze that.
Mm-hmm.
But I was interested to think about it more. So I've gone back and had a look to see if there was anything sort of obvious coming from the data to see if, when you group them, is any type of group more effective or not.
Yeah.
And annoyingly, there isn't any clear pattern emerging.
Right.
There's maybe something there around the family nurse partnership type interventions being effective.
Mm-hmm.
So they are, I don't know if you're aware of them, but they're home visiting interventions specifically for young mums who will probably be in more deprived areas. And they include antenatal care and early childhood development. There's very good continuity of care in these. So the woman will see the same either kind of health nurse or midwife throughout pregnancy and beyond. Interestingly, when we look at the data from this in the UK, it's not shown massive benefits. But when we look at the research from the US, it has been pretty effective there.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be down to the fact of, control groups. So in the US, young moms generally wouldn't get very much in the way of antenatal and postnatal care. So giving them this care is really going to benefit them. Whereas in the UK, all women do get a kind of basic level of midwifery care.
Yeah, so it's part of the standard care, that maternal care that they receive anyway. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's maybe why. So it's not necessarily the intervention isn't working. It's just not showing massive effects above and beyond what the women were getting anywhere in the UK.
Yeah.
And it's just, this is a problem that we face throughout the review. This difference in control groups adds this extra layer of complexity because some studies, women are getting some postnatal care and some breastfeeding support anyway. And the intervention is just adding some more to that.
Mm-hmm.
And a big issue we found was often the studies didn't define what the control group or what the standard care actually looked like. So there could again be an underestimation of the effects of the support where you've got a high level of control group care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a pity that it's hard to pinpoint these specifics because it's a big enough difference in the percentages. I was talking between 17 to 27%. That's a 10% difference, and it would be great to know, to see what the specifics are that could bring that figure up.
Exactly.
Another thing that was standing out for me across the board is the 4 to 6 weeks period and the 3-4 months period that stand out. That it looks like that breastfeeding support is the most impactful in those. When it was coming to the breastfeeding only, the exclusive breastfeeding, any breastfeeding, breastfeeding plus, these two particular times seems to stand out. Did you see any data in the trials to indicate why these particular periods stand out?
Not in the trials, but we did do, well, what we know from the trials, I suppose, first of all, is that the support tends by and large to be much more intensive at the start. The women get a lot of support in the first few weeks, maybe even up to the second month. But after that, it really tails up. There was very few interventions that carried on to the 6 months. But there's wider reasons. And this review was actually done as part of a much larger piece of work. We were funded by the National Institute of Health Research in the UK to try and better understand and develop interventions for breastfeeding support that could be implemented in the National Health Service. So this was the kind of first piece of work, was to try and identify interventions that might work. But then we had to go and speak to women and breastfeeding support providers to see, well, could these interventions work in the NHS? So we did a lot of focus groups and workshops across the UK with women, families, and peer supporters, and also people that work in the NHS. And we also did reviews of kind of qualitative literature and process evaluations too, to try and understand what the literature says about why things may succeed or fail. And some of the things that came out of all that work is that there are cultural and practical reasons. So, when you look at the literature from the US in particular, women are returning to work, very soon after birth. And that's where a lot of the studies were conducted.
Mm-hmm.
So that contributes to women having to stop breastfeeding,
Mm-hmm.
or feeling that they're not being supported to continue. And also in a lot of the studies where, and the UK, this is very much the case, the number of women generally breastfeeding to 6 months is so low.
Yes.
There's a bit of a floor effect there. So it's going to be really hard for these studies to lift it, because the expectations of women feeding until this point is low. So I think they're the two main reasons.
Mm-hmm.
It's the support not continuing beyond the early days, and these kind of cultural and practical reasons.
Could there be also like just normal infant growth specifics? Like is there a tendency that there is during the 4 to 6 weeks that it's more dominant than during the 3 to 4 months when it's more dominant, where
yes,
mom cannot keep up with it, doesn't think she has enough supply, starts to supplement?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that definitely happens at those periods.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you still need the support at that stage, isn't it? To say, look, this is normal, your baby will just be feeding, and women need to be supported. But if it's tailed off by that point, or some of the interventions, women could contact the providers for support, but it didn't seem to be that they were doing it that much. So if women aren't being told that this is normal infant behavior, then you can see why women would feel that, because concerns around supply are one of the biggest reasons women say for stopping breastfeeding before they would have liked to.
Yes. And something that ties in here and maybe underlines this exact point is that another finding is that a specific schedule of 4 to 8 contacts may have increased the number of women exclusively breastfeeding during this particular time, during this 4 to 6 weeks. So it really, again, comes back to that this is an important, significant time when moms would drop, either for cultural or circumstantial reasons or because of the infant growth reasons, breastfeeding. But if there is more intensive contact during this particular time, that will help to keep the numbers up. So I wondered, could you detail this part a little bit?
Yeah. So we tried to actually explore this statistically, because this was something we had enough data on. In the previous version of the review, we found the same. This 4 to 8 contacts seemed to be the most effective. So what we did was we took all the studies, and I'm going to talk about the breastfeeding only for now, and we compared the interventions, and we grouped them, and we said interventions, sorry, with less than 4 visits, and we compared them to interventions with 4 to 8 visits, and then more than 9. And we found that when they got 4 to 8 visits, it seemed to help with exclusive breastfeeding at 4 to 6 weeks and 6 months. We didn't do this analysis for the other time points. It didn't seem to change any breastfeeding, but it seemed to have this effect on exclusive breastfeeding.
And does the method of this contact matter?
Well, this is where it kind of gets interesting, I think, and where the qualitative data helps us a bit too. So again, we looked at this statistically. We compared face-to-face versus phone. We also tried to include digital interventions as well, although there was only a handful of those, to see what was going to be most effective. So again, we did a similar sort of analysis, and we didn't find any differences in whether the support was face-to-face or the phone or in the clinic or at home. And I think this is where the qualitative data, where we spoke to the women And when we reviewed the literature on this, this helps us and can pick this a little bit more. And from that, what we seemed to take away was there was a preference from the woman for the option to have face-to-face support, but with the addition of phone support when needed. Either on top of the face-to-face support, or some women found it harder to get out of the house, or maybe they lived in a more rural area. They had a preference for phone support. Another thing that came out of one of the groups that I did, which I thought was quite interesting, and it maybe explains the 4 to 8 contacts, was that too much support could also potentially be perceived by some women as being a bit invasive. They might not want lots of phone calls, particularly in those early days. And particularly these days, women aren't used to speaking on the phone that much. We don't really communicate that way. Messaging and things might be a better way. Unfortunately, there's not many studies that are evaluating these sorts of digital technologies, and I think that's maybe where the literature needs to go, because when we spoke to the women again, they had a bit of a preference for that. So I think really what is key is that the support needs to be flexible enough to be tailored to a woman and her family's needs. There needs to be an option of face-to-face support. And I think when you look at studies done during COVID, you can see that a lot of women, I think, struggle with the lack of face-to-face support. But there needs to be other options to provide the support too.
Mm-hmm. Did you find any difference in the effectiveness of support between the countries, especially between countries that have different income levels?
Yeah, we did find that. And that was something that we sort of expected to find. So it's something that we looked at statistically, because the reason for that is in low and middle income countries, they tend to have higher rates of breastfeeding. It's much more sort of standard for women to do some breastfeeding anyway, particularly up to 6 months and beyond, than in high income countries. What we found was that for exclusive breastfeeding at 6 months, breastfeeding only interventions were more effective in the low and middle income countries. And that's probably because in low and middle income countries, that's where the room for improvement is. Any breastfeeding rates at baseline are pretty high. Most women are doing some breastfeeding at 6 months. Mm-hmm. So the interventions can't really do very much there. But what you do see in a lot of low middle income countries is alternative foods and milks being introduced early. Mm-hmm. So the focus of these interventions wasn't getting women to breastfeed at all. The focus was trying to help women to exclusively breastfeed into 6 months. So that's where you can see the improvement.
Overall, the reason you have done this research is because it's important to improve outcomes for women and babies, and examining what is currently available and examining what works best is a great place to start. I think you have identified some clear specifics, especially like, for example, the 4 to 6 weeks period and the 3 to 4 months window and the significance of a scheduled contact. Do you have any main messages, additional points that you would like policymakers, healthcare professionals to get from this review?
Yeah, so as I think I mentioned, this piece of work is part of a much bigger study, and it helped us together with stakeholders and these other reviews develop an implementation and evaluation toolkit that decision makers can use. So first of all, we'd love to see them using that. Also, I think breastfeeding support needs to try harder to tackle socioeconomic inequalities. Part of the issue with this review is the women all wanted to breastfeed. So you were already talking about a fairly motivated group. Yeah. And we know that women from the most deprived groups are less likely to breastfeed. Yeah. So I think we need to focus more on that. And I think as well, the interventions, they need to be flexible to best meet the needs of women and their families, and not just be led by what's convenient for the healthcare providers. Yeah. This review was focused on women without long-term conditions, but we know the women with long-term conditions is increasing, and we actually did do an additional systematic review specifically for breastfeeding support for women with long-term conditions. This review found 116 studies. That review, we only found 22, and we found that the interventions weren't effective for this group of women. Mm-hmm. So there's therefore a clear need to try and develop interventions that could work for women. Well, either for all women or specifically for women with long-term conditions as well.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think it's very important work that you have done here, and I hope it will have the right impact.
Let's hope so.
In the hands of the right people. Thank you so much.
Thank you.